what do you think about the intro? Dramatic, right? Hi, welcome back. I'm Joschi, and in this episode we will talk about the neighborhood we live in for the last 25 years called Hell's Kitchen. But when you talk to the real estate businesses, they would say it's the Clinton district. But we say we live in Hell's Kitchen. And there's a reason why. And when you watched Gangs of New York, you know what I'm talking about, because they used to rule this neighborhood for the last 200 years. So we take you for a walk, a talk, take you 200 years backwards, and then bring you back to the future. But first of all, we have to bring Hell's Kitchen onto the map. So we are very close to Times Square, Midtown West. The border on the east side is 8th Avenue, and in the west side is the Hudson River. In the north is kind of 56th, 57th Street, somewhere around Columbus Circle. But it gets tricky when we're talking about the border on the south. We would say the border is 42nd Street, but historically it went all the way down to 34th Street, Penn Station. But when they built Penn Station and built Port Authority, that big bus terminal on 42nd Street and the Lincoln Tunnel, they demolished, destroyed a lot of that neighborhood. So when you want to visit Hell's Kitchen, and we highly recommend to do so, we will send you between 43rd and 56th Street. Yesterday I walked around and did a little bit B-roll for you, and coincidence, it took me exactly 10,000 steps. So I came up with the title, 10,000 Steps in Hell's Kitchen. Now, before we start, let me get my water, let me get the bag and Monika, and we will show you around. We will show you this great, charming, and slightly crazy neighborhood, Hell's Kitchen.
God bless you.
First, let's create a base so we find an answer why and how Hell's Kitchen was such a steamy and wild neighborhood. Picture this, 1830s. This was a working class neighborhood, and towards the east and the middle was more residential, and on the west side more for industrial purposes. And by the way, it was not called Hell's Kitchen, it was called Bloomingdale. It's a Dutch word also named after an area in the Netherlands. And just on the side, also a department store we all know took that name, and we know it now as Bloomingdale's. So on the west side, it was more about manufacturing. It was about crafting carriages, working with wood, making and selling leather goods like saddles for horses. But we also had lots of abattoirs, slaughterhouses running up and down this neighborhood. And in the 1830s, we also got the Hudson River Railroad, and the trains ran up and down in the middle of 10th and 11th Avenue on street level. So it must have been very dangerous to live here. They brought the materials for the businesses, but also the cattle to the abattoirs. So they got slaughtered because New Yorkers needed to be fed. Now, you can imagine this was a very aromatic and a very, very bad smelling neighborhood. Now, in the 1840s and 50s, the Irish and the Germans came, and they came by the boatload, thousands of them. And they settled down in the Lower East Side, but lots of Irish actually moved to this neighborhood here. And that gave the landlords the idea to make lots of money. They started to destroy all those one-family dwellings, those shanties, and created those 5 to 6 floor structures. Super cheap, poorly built, and completely unsanitary. Hundreds of those tenement buildings got built, and each of them housed at least 20 or more families. It was a very, very bad situation here. Now, in the 1870s, the Civil War was over, and New York experienced a boom, and that brought a new wave of immigrants. And at one point, they counted at least 200,000 and more Irish people here. But also at the same time, the African Americans now moved towards the north. They came to New York because of the job market. But they were so poor, they had to move in with the Irish. And the Irish hated that because now they had to compete with that group for the same jobs. So let's go for a quick break. There was a lot of information in a short period of time. And before we go into the juicy part, we also want to show you one of the oldest businesses, the oldest pubs here in New York City. And for sure, in Hell's Kitchen. It was built in 1868 and it comes with its own unique story.
So we're on our way to the landmark tavern, Hell's Kitchen oldest pub that Joschi just mentioned earlier. But before we get there, I want to tell you the intriguing story of the haunted, spooky past of the landmark tavern, because allegedly 3 ghosts live there. The first ghost belongs to George Raft. So in the 1920s, the illegal liquor business on the west side of Manhattan was run by the gangster Oni Madden. And one of his lieutenants, the Irish guy, Johnny Costello, was running the speakeasy on the 3rd floor of the landmark tavern. And he always had an entourage of people hanging around him. And one of those hangers-on was George Raft. George went on to become a big-shot movie star in Hollywood. And he successfully played gangsters because he was rubbing shoulders with real-life gangsters at the landmark tavern. As a movie gangster, his signature move was to flick a nickel up into the air. And even when he was super famous, every time he came back to New York City, he would visit the landmark tavern. On Monday, November 24, 1980, it was a super slow night at the landmark tavern. And around midnight, the bartender decided to close up because nobody was there. So he went to the front door to lock it, and when he looked back, he saw an older gentleman leaning at the far end of the bar. He was surprised because he thought the place was empty, so he turned around to unlock the front door. When he looked back, the gentleman was gone. But where he had been standing, there was a nickel from 1926. At the same time in Los Angeles, the older gentleman that the bartender had seen at the landmark tavern, George Raft, had passed away. So maybe the nickel was George's way of bidding farewell to the place that he loved so much. The second ghost belongs to Mary Moynihan. The little girl and her dad took the long and arduous journey from Ireland to America in search of a better life. They arrived in New York City on July 5th, 1875, and they were almost not let off the boat because they didn't have a sponsor. John McChrystal vouched for them and took them back to the landmark tavern, where they got a small room on the 3rd floor. Unfortunately, Mary got really sick with tuberculosis, and Mrs. McChrystal took pity in the poor girl and took her into the family home to nurse her back to health. She put a small brass bell next to her bed in case she needed something. Unfortunately, Mary didn't get any better. And one day late at night, Mary stood on top of the stairwell, delirious with fever, and she was calling out for her dead mother. They put her back to bed. Her dad was sitting at her side and wanted to watch over her. But he was so tired, he fell asleep for a moment. He woke up at 2 a.m. because he heard the bell ringing. When he looked over to Mary, Mary was gone. And even though all this happened about 150 years ago, every now and then, when everything is still and calm at the landmark tavern, you can hear that faint, ethereal sound of a brass bell. If you're one of the people who believe that ghosts exist because they have a lifelong longing that never got fulfilled, it totally makes sense that George and Mary's ghosts still live in the landmark tavern today. It would also explain why the tormented soul of Travis Martin refuses to leave. Travis was a nasty guy. He was a Southerner from Virginia, and sometime during the Civil War, he and his friend Edward Ducksworth enlisted. They both got wounded. Edward got shot in the hand, and Travis got shot in the leg. Since Edward's wound wasn't life-threatening, he was sent home to recuperate. Travis's wound, on the other hand, was severe. He needed surgery and had a long road of recovery ahead of him. So he asked his friend to keep an eye on the love of his life, Matilda Hathaway. Things got even worse when Travis became a prisoner of war. And by the time the war ended, Edward and Matilda had fallen in love. So there was no point in returning to Virginia. Ultimately, Travis made his way up to New York City, where he lived in a rundown tenement apartment on 41st Street. On Saturdays, he would take his pay to the landmark tavern, got drunk, and pick a fight. When Travis found out that Edward and Matilda had gotten married, he got even drunker than usual and picked a fight with the meanest, toughest, and strongest guy in the bar. They both picked out their weapon of choice, smashed into the back room, and fought on the back staircase. Travis's gut got slashed open. There was blood everywhere, and his intestines were hanging out. Travis crawled up to the second floor, staggered into the bathroom, and collapsed in the bathtub, where he ultimately bled out and died. This bathtub still exists today, and on occasion, there are mysterious blood-like stains that appear and disappear.
So the question is, do you believe in ghosts? Now, let's go back to our timeline. Let's go back to 1870. More and more people were drawn to New York, and hundreds of those cheap tenement buildings were constructed, but the housing conditions were still horrible, and that created kind of an instability and chaos in the communities. And now we had two problems on hand: social and religious. And the best example were actually the Irish, the Protestants and the Catholics, because they didn't get along with each other at all. So let me create a little story around them. Picture this: July 12, 1870. The Protestants got ready for their celebration parade, and while they got ready, they got watched by the Catholics from the sidewalks, from the apartment windows. So when the Protestants marched up on 8th Avenue, they start heckling the Catholics, call them all sorts of names, you know, the whole 9 yards. The Catholics, on the other hand, couldn't take that crap, so they came down and followed them up to the park on the Upper West Side where the parade ended. And right away, they started a huge fight. And the fight went on for hours. And on that day, at least 9 people died. Now, New York had to decide, can they allow another parade the following year? But because of all that political pressure, the governor at that time gave him the green light. But he also ordered lots of policemen to secure the streets. Now, 1871. The Protestants got ready for their parade, but the Catholics were also ready and prepared. So when the Protestants marched up on the streets, the Catholics threw stones, bricks, bottles, shoes, everything they could find onto the Protestants. The Protestants, on the other hand, started screaming and yelling. So the Catholics came down, and right away again, they had a huge fight. Of course, the police came, but at that time, the streets looked like a war zone. On that day, at least 60 people died and over 100 people got wounded. It was a huge scandal, and the headline in the news read, "Slaughter on 8th Avenue." And the reporter wrote, the streets were covered with blood, brains, and vomit. It was a disaster, and the second biggest riot New York experienced after the Civil War, and known as the Orange Man riot. And the Orange Man stood for the Protestants. Now, let's move forward to the 1880s. The Tenderloin was New York's red light and entertainment district, and it got bigger and bigger. It was located around Herald Square between 24th and 42nd Street. And here you could find all the dance halls and the gamble casinos and the bordellos, the brothels, the saloons, you know, all the fun stuff. But now it also expanded over to the west side. And the block 39th Street between 7th and 8th was the crazy one. A French lady came over, opened a few establishments, and offered the most outrageous things you can imagine. You know what I'm talking about. But the worst was actually 39th Street between 10th and 11th Avenue. It even got its own name, Battleground. And 2 really bad buildings were there. The House of Blazers and another one called, now listen up, Hell's Kitchen. And the prostitutes and thieves there fought with each other and with the police on almost daily basis. But the worst was actually they lured the innocents in by offering them a free drink, robbed them, and then lit them on fire. This was also the time where the gangs started to organize themselves, but we will talk about them in a moment. In the 1900s, the gangs were synonymous with New York and we had lots of them. But one particular gang dominated the city for quite a while, and those were the Gophers, an Irish gang. And they got the name because they preferred having their meetings in basements. They were more sophisticated because they also knew how to create criminal networks throughout the city. But the groups were very dangerous because they were super chaotic and unpredictable. Not even their leaders survived more than a few months. So when you looked at them the wrong way, said something wrong or made a stupid joke, you were gone. There were also women groups called the Lady Gophers, and they were led by one particular lady for quite a while. Her name was Battle Annie, and she was also known as the Queen of Hell's Kitchen. Talking about the crime, the Gophers were focused on the industries on the west side. They broke into stores and factories. But their specialty were actually the trains which run up and down 10th and 11th Avenue. Remember, we talked about them in the beginning of the video. They jumped on those bypassing trains, stole the goods, and then sold it somewhere else. Now, after Prohibition and World War II, things here changed quite a lot. And actually, lots of people lost their jobs, especially the ones who worked in the shipping industry down at the piers. And a new group of people moved into the neighborhood, the Puerto Ricans. And of course, the Irish gave them a hard time. And just on the side, if you like watching musicals, watch the West Side Story. It describes the situation pretty good. Now, with the Gophers gone, a new group gained strength, and they were called the Westies, also known as the Irish Mafia. And they ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist. And their list of crimes included racketeering, money laundering, drug dealing, extortion, kidnapping, and almost every single day someone got shot. It got even worse and beyond brutal when they teamed up with the infamous Gambini family. It was so bad that in the middle of the 80s, New York said enough is enough. And one prosecutor took them on. It took them 3 years to get each and every leader sent to prison. Now, in the 1990s, things changed again and Hell's Kitchen opened up and people from all walks of life moved into the neighborhood. White, black, gay, straight, and so many different nationalities.
And that's our story and the story of Hell's Kitchen. So the next time you're in New York, come on over and explore our charming and colorful neighborhood and bring the story to life.